you're going to be responsible for your next exam, which is a ways away, but just to kind of get you in the right mindset, your next exam will cover Chapter 6 and 7 and just a little bit of material out of Chapter 8. We're not going to cover everything out of Chapter 8, just some important things. Chapter 6 covers bone and skeletal tissue. So we're actually now going to look, if I held up this, what would you tell me this was? It's bone tissue, right? Tree trunks, spider webs. We've already seen it. This chapter is going to actually tell us what all the little things in that picture are, how they work together to make a bone function the way it's supposed to. Okay? So we are still going to kind of be on the microscopic level in some parts of Chapter 6. This is where the physiology is going to come into play, a little bit in this chapter. Chapter 7 is straight memorization. You may as well get ready. Get you a picture of the skeleton and start memorizing every bone where it is. Okay? And after that, then get you some pictures of the individual bones, and you got to start learning all the markings and the different parts of the bones. Okay? It's not because I'm mean. It's because that's what we're required to do in here. Okay? We're going to go through it. We're actually going to hold the bones in lab, and that really helps a lot when you're actually able to hold it and look at it instead of just looking at a plain generic picture. For the most part, yes. You will still do a little bit with microscopes, but not as in-depth as we've already done. Okay? All right, so today let's go through Chapter 6, and then in lab we will start learning bones today as well. But in lecture, we're just going to try to go through Chapter 6 today. Okay? Before we go too far and get to really talking about bones, let's make sure we all remember our 3 types of cartilage. I hope you do. You just took a test on them, right? Okay, so we have 3 types of cartilage. In general, cartilage belongs to what type of tissue? It's a connective tissue. So that means it's going to have a ground substance, fibers, and cells, right? What type of cells do you have in cartilage? Chondrocytes. Good. Okay, so all that stuff we've already learned still holds true. Okay, none of it changes. Okay, the first type of cartilage, hyaline cartilage, has lots of collagen. Hyaline cartilage is flexible but still gives us some support. Okay, I'm going to show you a picture in just a second. Elastic cartilage has many more elastic fibers, so it's a much more flexible tissue. Fibrocartilage is the strongest of all of the cartilages. Okay? So if we look at a picture, we can remember exactly where all these cartilages are found, right? Okay? Where do you have hyaline cartilage? The end of your nose, in your ribs, and the ends of bones. That's what you memorized in Chapter 4, right? Okay. So now why is that going to be so important in this chapter? Because we're going to be learning the names of all these bones. And on the ends of bones, like this big long bone in the upper leg called the femur, the top of it has a really nice thick layer of hyaline cartilage. Okay? Sometimes you won't see it called hyaline cartilage. Doesn't mean it's not. But sometimes you'll also see it called articular cartilage. Okay? So articular and hyaline are kind of used sort of in the same way in this chapter, in this section of the text. Because when 2 things articulate, what does that mean? You may know? They touch. They connect to each other. Okay? So the reason it's called articular cartilage is because the hyaline cartilage is located in an area where 2 bones hook together. So we're going to cover this now, and we're going to repeat this again in Chapter 8 when we're actually talking about that joint. We're going to see that hyaline cartilage over and over and over again. Okay? Also, you guys told me that there's lots of hyaline cartilage in the ribs. So when you actually look at this, do you see how much of this is blue? Okay? All of your ribs connect to the central bone in your chest called the sternum through a big, thick piece of hyaline cartilage. Okay? This little thing hanging down right here, called the xiphoid process. It is completely made of hyaline cartilage. As you get much, much older, it does start to ossify, meaning it starts to turn to bone, but you have to be older than us for it to be completely bone. Young babies, much more hyaline cartilage. Okay? Where's the elastic cartilage going to be? External ear, and also the little flap, the epiglottis, which we'll talk about in A&P 2. Okay? And the last one, fibrocartilage, where is it found? In the knees, the disc of the back between the vertebrae, and pubic symphysis. Okay? So you can see how the two hip bones come together at the bottom, and there's that nice little layer of red cartilage. So we're going to see, we've already gone over this, but you're going to see this again, so don't forget. Okay? Something else that should look familiar. How are we going to categorize the bones? Well, we're going to separate the skeleton into two parts, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. What does axial mean? Central trunk of the body. What does appendicular mean? Limbs. Okay, so look at this picture. The axial is dark brown. The appendicular is kind of that light brown tan color. So tell me what bones make up the axial skeleton. The cranium and face, right? The bones of the skull. What else? The ribs and the vertebrae. Are the hip bones part of the axial skeleton? No. Those are the most commonly mixed up bones. Because people, I guess, remember them as being in the center, but not only the bones of the limbs, also the bones that attach to the limbs are considered appendicular. So the hip bones are easier to see. So you see the big hip bones right here? Those, as well as all the bones of the leg, are considered appendicular. The arm is appendicular. And you see this little bone right here? Okay, that's what you know as the collarbone, the clavicle. That is also part of the appendicular skeleton because it holds the arm in place. Okay, so just kind of keep that in the back of your head. That's the most commonly confused pieces. Now, before we start learning the names of all these bones, we're going to look at bones in general, go back to that microscopic image, and make sure we understand how it all works together. Okay, all of the bones in your body, both the bones of the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton, when you look at them, they're either going to be long bones, short bones, irregular bones, or flat bones. And for once in science, we named something in an easy way to remember it. What do you think a long bone is? A bone that's longer than it is wide. Where do you think you would have long bones in your body? Your legs and your arms, and also in your fingers. Okay? Now you say, wait, my finger bone's not very long. It's longer than it is wide, right? Otherwise our fingers would be this wide and this long, right? So any part of your body that's a long, slender piece, like your legs, your arms, your fingers, that's going to be long bones. Where do you think you're going to have short bones? Toes, okay, in the feet, in the wrist. Short bones almost look square in shape. They're about the same length as they are width, okay? And what do you think a flat bone's going to be? What does it look like? Tell me that. Flat. Do you think it's always the entire thing's going to be flat? That's not possible, right? Otherwise there wouldn't be many that fit into that category. Your flat bones are going to be bones that the majority of the bone is very flat and smooth and gets really thin. Okay? I'll give you an example. What do you think the bones of your skull, do you think they're flat or do you think they're big and thick? If they were big and thick, what would I be doing? Would I be standing like this or would I be standing like this? My head would be heavy, right? So you have those nice little thin, flat bones that make up our skull. Your ribs are also flat bones. Okay? When you feel the sides right here, those bones are smooth and nice and flat. Okay? Say it louder. Your collarbone's an irregular bone. And when you see it up close, you'll be able to tell why. Your collarbone actually looks like an S. Your clavicle has a little twist to it. Okay? So irregular is anything that doesn't fit into the other three categories. Okay? Best example of an irregular bone would be your vertebrae. Okay? And I heard somebody say vertebrae when we talked about flat, because one side of your vertebrae is flat, but your vertebrae is a circle with a bunch of extensions sticking out. So that's why we consider it irregular. It's just a really funny shape. Okay? So as we go through all the bones, we're going to look at them this way. But you guys did a pretty good job of predicting. Long bones are going to be in the limbs. Flat bones are going to be ribs, the chest bones, skull bones. Okay, see, here's the vertebrae. See, it's got all this junk sticking out the side? That's what makes it irregular. This is the talus. That's the major bone that gets all the weight in your ankle. You see how it's about the same width as it is height. So that's why that's considered a short bone. Okay? All right. So what do bones do for us? What's their function? Support, structure, protection. That's usually what most people right offhand come out with. And that's absolutely true. Those are some of the most important functions bones have for us. They support our body, help us to walk upright. They support all of our organs. They protect those organs, your brain, your spinal cord, and your vertebral and cranial cavities. Very important for that. Now, other things you may not right away have thought of as functions of bone. Your bones are a huge storage site in your body. Okay? Tell me one thing you know is stored in your bone. Calcium. We all know that, right? That's one thing that makes our bones nice and hard. Okay? You have just as much phosphorus in your bone as you do calcium. Okay? The elemental symbol for phosphorus is P. Is there any important molecule in your body you need P's to make? Energy. What's the symbol for energy? ATP. Okay, so you got to store the phosphorus somewhere so you can make energy whenever you need it, and this is where you store it. Scientifically, I'd kind of argue that phosphorus is probably more important than the calcium in your bones. I mean, calcium is important too. Okay? Blood cell formation, properly called hematopoiesis. We won't really talk about that until chapter 17, which is A&P I. But a lot of that does go on inside of the bone marrow. Where's your bone marrow at? In the inside of your bone, right? You all kind of know that, right? Okay. The last thing is triglyceride storage. Anybody know what a triglyceride is? It's a fat. Okay. You store fat in your bones. That's actually the first place you put it. So if you got any fat in other regions, that means your bones are full. And you had extra, so your body had to stick it somewhere. And I'm sure we all do. Okay? All right, so on a microscopic level, y'all's favorite word, right? On the microscopic level. Bone, if we cut a bone in half and looked at it, it's going to look one of two ways. It's going to be compact or spongy. So what do you think compact means? It's dense, it's thick, right? There's not going to be a bunch of little holes in it, right? If you cut that bone, it's going to be a solid piece of bone, right? Now, it can't be solid all the way through, right? Because what has to be in the middle of every bone? Your bone marrow, right? So it's not going to be solid all the way through, but the majority is going to be solid. What we looked at in the microscope that looked like tree trunks, that was compact bone, okay? The other type of bone is called spongy bone. What does a sponge look like? It's got little holes in it. It's porous, right? It's got little pieces going every which way, and there's little canals, little holes in it, okay? We didn't look at that under the microscope because it's kind of hard to identify. It mixes up with some of the others. But that is going to be parts of some of our bones. So we're going to kind of look at both and talk about them now. Okay? I always start out with the structure of a long bone. Right? The reason we start with structure of a long bone is if you learn the long bone, then you can just say, okay, the flat one and the short one, the irregular one is different by this. So we learn kind of the most complicated one. That makes the other one seem a lot easier. Okay? So if I was going to draw a long bone, right, I'm going to draw what I call my cheesy Fido bone. Right? Maybe they have dogs, right? So here's my bone. So why did I draw it that way? Because the ends are usually bigger than the center, right? Does that make sense? Okay? The ends and the center have different names. The center part of this bone, which is the skinny part, is called the diaphysis. Okay? So you guys say that word. Say diaphysis. Okay? Good. So from now on, don't come up to me and go that D word. You can say it too, right? Diaphysis. The end, the bulging out portion, is called an epiphysis. So say epiphysis. Okay? Every long bone has one diaphysis and two epiphyses. Okay? So epiphysis is singular. Epiphyses is plural. All right? So how do you tell them apart? The way you tell them apart, of course, the epiphysis is wider. Why does the end of the bone, the epiphysis, need to be wider? What's going to be right up here? Another bone. Hyaline cartilage, articular cartilage, right? And then another bone's going to hook up. So what's going to form a better connection? A little skinny piece to a skinny piece? Of course not, right? So the bones bulge out at the end, so you have two nice connections to make a joint between the two bones. Okay? But if we didn't have this connected to other bones, the way you tell them apart is there's actually a little line right here at the end of the diaphysis. Those lines are called the epiphyseal lines. It's also called the epiphyseal plate. In this chapter in your textbook, they teach you a lot about how bones grow. We're not going to cover that in this class just because we don't have time to cover everything. But just really briefly, the point of that epiphyseal plate or line, that is where your bone growth occurs. Okay? So if this bone I've drawn on the board was going to grow, it wouldn't just grow all out in all different directions because there'd be no control to keep it nice and long and thin. So it just grows from those plates. And the diaphysis would grow up, the epiphysis grows down. Okay? Now, the diaphysis is made of compact bone. So what this is actually going to look like is you're going to have really, really thick bone all right here on the sides. That's going to be compact bone down both sides. Now, I left the hole in the middle, not because I wrote something there. Why did I leave that hole in the middle? That's your marrow cavity. This is where your bone marrow is going to be located. Okay? The top, or the epiphysis of the bone, I'm just going to draw it at the bottom, it's not compact. It's spongy. So it just kind of looks like that. Okay. So let's see if we can predict why. What's the function of compact, dense bone? Strength. Okay. What part of this bone do I need to be stronger? The long, thin region or the big fat end of it? Long, thin part, right? Otherwise, when I was walking around, my poor femur is carrying so much weight, if the center of my femur was spongy bone, it would just crack from under the pressure. So I have all of that compact bone in the length of my bone that gives me the strength. The end of the bone, it doesn't need to be strong because it's not holding weight. It's providing a connection point that's going to be a joint that's going to ultimately allow movement with the bones. Does that make sense? Okay. As little babies, we had red bone marrow flowing through all of this, the entire long bone. Now that we're adults, we don't have that anymore. Our big center bone marrow cavity in our diaphysis is filled with yellow bone marrow. What do you think's inside a yellow bone marrow? Fat. Okay? That's the big place we store our triglycerides, our fat. There is some red bone marrow left in the epiphyses, but that's not the major place we have red bone marrow. I'll show you that in just a few minutes. Okay? Right now we're just talking about long bones. Okay? Someone said it, but just to make our picture complete, I need to draw a piece of cartilage up here, right? And a piece of cartilage down here. And what type of cartilage did we say that was? Hyaline, articular cartilage. Good. Okay. Does that make sense? My drawing is beautiful, so it should make sense. All right. So here's their drawing, if you didn't think mine was good enough. Okay. So can you see the difference between the diaphysis and the epiphyses? You see a difference? Do you see the epiphyseal line that allows you to tell where the diaphysis ends and the epiphysis begins? Okay? Everybody see that? So you have nice compact bone here all along the edges of the diaphysis. You got the yellow bone marrow running down the center. Okay? Spongy bone here in the epiphysis. Okay? That's why you can see the little holes in it. If we cut that and we blow it up, doesn't this look exactly like a sponge? You know what I'm talking about? It's got the little pieces sticking out everywhere, nice little holes running through. Okay? Now, there are some little lining layers. Okay? So your bone is not just a hard piece of bone. It's got some nice little pieces of membranes around it because this is an organ. We need to protect it. The outside layer, all the way on the outside of the bone, is called the periosteum. And that's this word right here. Okay? It is not hyaline cartilage. And I think the textbook kind of screws up because they kind of make the lining look blue. But it's not cartilage. It's just a membrane called the periosteum. Okay? If I scooped out all of my yellow bone marrow and I had my finger and I was touching the inside of the marrow cavity, there's another membrane that lines that cavity. That's called the endosteum. Okay, that's this word right here. Okay. You may as well learn those prefixes because from here on out, every section we go through, if it's a membrane lining the outside of something, it's peri. If it's a membrane lining the inside of something, it's endo. Okay. Where does the osteum come from? Because we're talking about bones. Osteo means bone. Okay, so those should just become kind of natural to you. Okay, does everybody understand the structure of the long bone? Most part? Okay, so while I've got it here, let me show you what a short bone, a flat bone, and an irregular bone looks like. Okay, I'm just going to draw a flat bone, just have one to draw. You have compact bone on one end, compact bone on the other side, spongy in the middle. There are no, all of them are the same, flat, short, and irregular. There are not a whole lot of structural names you need to learn or anything like that. You just need to understand I've got a thin layer of compact bone on the outside, spongy bone in the middle. Okay? So those are much easier than the long bone, right? That's why we do long bone first. As an adult, so this is true for flat, short, and irregular. Outside is compact bone. Inside is spongy bone. As an adult, these types of bones, in there where it's spongy, that's where you have red bone marrow. Okay? So if I want to donate bone marrow to somebody, how do they get it out of me? It's not just a syringe, because where do they got to get it? They got to go in the inside of my bone, right? They got to drill a little hole through your bone, stick a big syringe in, and suck out the bone marrow. It's only in flat, short, and irregular bones. Do you know what bones they usually take it from? Ribs and hips are the two most common. Now, they can get it from other places, but the rib bones and your hip bones are the two most common places they take bone marrow from. Now, I've never done it, but they say it's extremely painful. So one of my students in another class made the comment, well, they pay you a lot of money for it. They'd have to pay me a lot of money to get mine. Now, a family member is usually the only time most people will donate bone marrow. Because if you're really sick and you need bone marrow, the only way to test and see if you can have my bone marrow is to take some of mine out and test it. So that's why most people don't just say, oh yeah, I'll donate some bone marrow anytime you need me to. You usually have to have a pretty good relationship with somebody. You can't do a blood test because your bone marrow is not just blood. There's stem cells and other hematopoietic cells inside of your bone marrow. It's very different. Well, yeah, I mean, they can tell. Of course, if you're like different blood types and completely different, they're not even going to go that far. But like my child may not necessarily match my bone marrow. There's a possibility that they may not. So it happens, but it's pretty rare for you to be a match to just a complete stranger. Okay, and that has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but most people usually kind of wanted to know when we start talking about red bone marrow. Okay? So does everybody understand the structure we've gone over so far? Yes? Everybody's with me? Good. All right. So we talked about periosteum, endosteum. So we still hadn't really said anything about cells, right? And we haven't said anything about what those little tree trunks are, right? And I said at the beginning that's what we were going to do. Okay? So this is a blown up, enlarged picture of the diaphysis. Okay? do you see the tree trunks? You see them now, right? Because this is the diaphysis, right? That's the shaft part of the bone wrapped around the yellow bone marrow. Now, I also like this picture because you can see they took the periosteum, that membrane on the outside, and they kind of pulled it back where you could see it's just a little thin layer. Okay? Those little circles, that's what we were looking at when we looked under the microscope. Okay? That's the smallest structural unit of a bone. Each one of these little circles, what you call a tree trunk or a spider web, each one of those is called an osteon. Okay? It takes millions of osteons to make a bone. Okay? Now, we're looking at this bone straight up and down, right? Okay? What we saw when we looked at the microscope was this piece of bone that had been leaned forward, right? And you were looking down the bone. Is everybody with me? Figures in your textbook mean nothing if you can't orient yourself with figures. Okay? So, okay, I'm going to come back to this. Trying to get to what I want to get to. Okay, so let's look at this structure of the osteon. The first two words we're going to learn are lamella and Haversian canal. Okay? So let me show you this picture. Can you relate this at all to the osteon we looked at just a second ago? How could this look like a tree trunk? If you're looking straight down, right? So this, again, is sitting straight up. In a minute, we're going to lean it over and look straight down it. Okay? The reason this is here is, do you remember when we looked at this under the microscope, there was a dark spot in the center, right? And then all the stuff kind of came out from it. Is that what it looked like, right? This dark spot in the center, that is the central canal, or the Haversian canal. Okay? What is sticking up out of that central canal right here? Arteries, veins, and nerves. Did you know your bones could bleed? They can. Okay? They're a living tissue in your body. The only tissue in your body that doesn't have blood is epithelial and cartilage. Cartilage is special connective tissue. It doesn't have any blood flow. There's blood flowing through your bones. It flows through that central canal, that Haversian canal. Okay, so let's pretend that this marker I have in my hand, that's the central canal. That's my blood vessels. Okay? If I'm going to make bone tissue, I take one layer of bone tissue and I wrap around my blood vessel. I've just put one lamella around my blood vessel. Okay? Then I take another layer and I put my next layer, my next lamella around my blood vessel. Okay? So if I flip my hands over, do you see how that's starting to make the tree trunk structure? Okay? So each little ring of bone is a lamella. Okay? So if I look at this right here, here's the first lamella wrapped around the blood vessels, the next lamella. Okay? Through here is where you have all of the collagen fibers running through. Why do I have collagen fibers? What type of tissue did you tell me this was? It's connective tissue, so it's got to have fibers in it, right? Okay, good. So now when we flip it this way, okay, do you see this part right here? That's what we were just looking at, right? Everybody still with me? You can follow along with the pictures? Okay. Now we have flipped it down. Okay? And we're looking down the bone. Okay? Every osteon, it has a central or Haversian canal with several layers of lamella wrapped around it. Then there'll be another Haversian canal with several layers of lamella, bone tissue wrapped around it. Everybody with me? Say that again. Yeah, this is just one pulled out to show you how it works. There's not actually one piece sticking out. Everybody with me? Okay, so let's look a little closer down here. So, what is this? That dark circle right here. That's that Haversian canal right in the center. Okay? What do you think these little dark black spots are? I'll give you a hint. Okay, they're labeled lacunae, right? Have we seen lacunae before? What's inside a lacunae? Okay, Chondrocytes were in the cartilage, right? So what type of cell is going to be in these lacunae? Osteocytes. Okay? Those little dark spots we see at the edges of each of the lamella are the osteocytes and the osteoblasts. Okay? Those are the little bone cells. Makes sense that we need cells, right? It's a living tissue. Now, do you think this cell right here needs to be able to communicate with that cell? Do the cells in your body need to be able to communicate with each other? Absolutely, right? So it's kind of hard to see in the projection, but if you look really closely, you can see some little squiggly lines kind of running through. Can everybody see those? Those little squiggly lines, you can see it better over here in the drawing. So here's one lacuna, here's another lacuna, and you see these little squiggly lines running that way? Those are called canaliculi. I don't know who came up with the terminology, but the canaliculi connect one lacunae with another so they can communicate with each other. Okay? Now, so if those cells need to talk to each other, do you think that the blood vessels and nerves in this central canal may need to communicate with the blood vessels and nerves in this central canal? Right? So as you go a little ways along the central canal, there'll be what we call a perforating canal. It's a little connection point between two different central canals. That's actually called a Volkmann's canal. And it's named after some guy, just like Haversian Canal, named after somebody. Okay? I got that? So now if we go back and look through all these words that I flipped through that you guys were thinking I wasn't going to go over, where did I stop? Okay. Now, I skipped this because I wanted to show you where all this stuff was before we went through it. Okay. So what type of cells do we have in bones? Most of you already predicted. We have osteocytes. Those are the mature cells. We have osteoblasts. What did we say blasts were in the beginning? They're immature cells. They're the cells that are still growing and developing. Okay? What do you think an immature bone cell is still growing and making? He's making bone. He's making your bone stronger, right? So as you're a little kid, what cells are going to be extremely active? Osteoblasts, because their job is to make bone. Okay? As we get older, do you think our osteoblasts just stop working? And they just all of a sudden die and no more bone making? That doesn't seem real smart, right? So what actually happens is as we get older, we get another set of cells that start working called osteoclasts. Osteoclasts break down bone tissue. So now that we're a little older, we may make a little bone for a while, and if we need to, then we can break down a little bone. I used to just leave it at that, and most people never really understood why are we making and breaking down bone. So let's look at it this way. If I have a bone, okay, and we're talking as an adult, what did we say was stored in that bone? Okay, fat. What else? Fat, calcium, and phosphorus, right? Okay. What the osteoblasts and osteoclasts do. Okay. Let's say I just drank a whole bunch of milk. So when you eat or drink something, it absorbs through your digestive system and it ends up in your blood vessel, right? Now all the milk's not going to be in my blood vessel. What's going to be in my blood vessel? Calcium from the milk, right? So why did I just bother drinking all that milk and getting all that calcium in my blood? Because what do I want to do with it? Put it in my bone and store it for later, right? Okay. The osteoblast is going to pick up that calcium, stick it in your bone. Okay. Well, let's say I haven't drank any milk in a really long time. Well, what if my nerve cells, my brain cells need calcium? Because they do. They need calcium. If I haven't eaten any in a while, where's my brain going to get the calcium from? From my bone. So I have a cell called an osteoclast. He can break down enough of that bone to get the calcium out. Does that help you make a little more sense? Okay. I think people at first have this vision of the bone growing and the bone shrinking, bone growing and bone shrinking. That's not really what's happening. Those osteoblasts and osteoclasts are putting stuff in the bone or taking stuff out of the bone for us. That make sense? Okay. Where are all of these found? What did we just talk about? Where at in the bone? Okay, in the diaphysis, in the compact bone. Where at in the compact bone? All the way in these little lacunae within each of the little lamella. Okay? So make sure you link everything together. All those little cells are compacted and found throughout all of those little osteons. Okay? Now do you have an understanding of why that blood needs to run through that bone? What's the blood bringing to the bone? Calcium that you've ingested, right? Okay. Why do I need nerves running through my bone? So a sense of feeling, right? If I break my bone, I need to know it, right? I need to have some nerves in there. I also need my brain to be able to send information to my bones. Like, I need calcium. Send me some calcium, okay? It's starting to kind of put a few things together, okay? This is the hard one as far as learning structure, the compact bone, okay? If we go back, and I'm sorry I'm flipping. I guess I just didn't think when I made this. If we go back and look at, this is a flat bone. This is the bone of the skull. We don't have a whole bunch of structures. If we look at this under the microscope, it doesn't look like tree trunks. Right? There's only one word that you need to know, and that is trabeculae. Okay? In a spongy bone, you just have all those little trabeculae sticking up, and the bone marrow just runs through it. Okay? The cells are just randomly distributed within the bone. You don't have a whole bunch of structures you have to learn. But the same thing's going to happen here. You're going to have osteoblast, building bone, meaning putting things in the bone. Osteoclast, breaking it down. That make sense? Yes, no, sort of? Okay. All right, we already talked about that. Where is bone marrow found? Okay, we talked about trabeculae. All right. Now, so what is the texture of bone? It's hard, right? Is it possible for your bone to be too hard? Very possible. Is it possible for your bones to be too soft? What happens to old people when they stop having as much calcium and phosphorus in their bone? Osteoporosis, and their bones get brittle and their bones break. Okay? All right. So you all know everything I'm about to tell you. You just don't know it in proper terminology. Okay? Inside of your bone, you have, this is connective tissue, right? You have cells. We talked about the cells. Okay? You have ground substance. What's ground substance? The matrix in the background, right? You have collagen fibers because it's connective tissue. You all knew that from chapter 4. Okay? The last thing your bone has in it is called an hydroxyapatite. It's the fancy chemical name for the way calcium and phosphorus. That's not right. Sorry. No, I'm not writing down the chemical symbols. I'm scared I'm going to write it wrong. It's the way calcium and phosphate link together. Okay? If you have too much calcium and phosphate in your bone is super hard. It can shatter very easily. If you have not enough, your bones will easily break. And if you take enough of it out, your bone will get flimsy. Okay? I don't remember the chemicals. It's been a long time since I've done this. But you can look it up on the internet, I'm sure. Really cool little science projects to do with your kids. Okay? Take you a chicken bone. Alright? Take all the meat off and everything. Okay? Take the chicken bone and you dip it in one chemical. And what that chemical does is cause the bone to absorb a ton of calcium and phosphorus, a ton of hydroxyapatite. Once you take that bone out and it's full and it's got way too much hydroxyapatite in it, if you drop it on the table, the bone is so hard, it will shatter into a million pieces. Okay? You take another chicken bone just like it and you put it in a different solution. The other solution pulls all the calcium and phosphorus out of it, When you take that chicken bone out, you can bend it like a rubber band. Okay? So it's a pretty cool little thing if anybody's as dorky as me, something you can play with at home. Okay? Alright, so what am I trying to get a point across to you? Everything we've already learned is true. It's a connective tissue, so it's got a ground substance, it's got collagen fibers. Well, what makes it bone? This is what makes it bone. This is what makes it hard and makes it different from the other connective tissues we've talked about. Okay? The hydroxyapatite, the way the calcium and phosphorus link together. It's really bugging me that I can't. That is right. Calcium phosphate. Okay, that is right. It was bugging me. All right. Last little thing we're going to talk about today, but we're not done. We're going to go back and review a few things, is how these bones are regulated. Okay? And the reason I make a point to go through it is because most people don't really think about your hormones control everything your bones do. Okay? Most of us know our hormones control a lot of other stuff. All of the growth of your bone is controlled by hormones. Okay? What's the most important hormone that tells our bone to grow when we're a little kid? What you think? What's it called? Growth hormone. Okay? Growth hormone, human growth hormone, you usually hear it called HGH. That is the hormone that we release. The pituitary tells part of the other pituitary to release it. And that goes to that epiphyseal plate and tells our bones to grow. Okay? Do you think we're producing a whole lot of growth hormone right now? No. That is why our bones are no longer growing in lean. But what our bones are still doing is putting calcium in, taking calcium out. That's what our hormones are focused on right now. Okay, and the hormones that do that are related to the thyroid, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in the next, in A&P too. As adults, another important set of hormones that are affecting our bones right now are testosterone and estrogen. Okay? Who is more likely to develop osteoporosis when they get older, men or women? Women. Why do you think it's related to age? What do women stop making when they get older? Estrogen. Okay? High levels of estrogen are required to keep enough calcium in our bones. When you stop making enough estrogen, you no longer put enough calcium into your bone. And that's why women, that's one reason we used to do hormone replacement therapy with women. Now we've related it to breast cancer and all sorts of stuff. So now we just tell women just load up on the calcium, and hopefully that'll take the place of not producing enough estrogen. But men produce estrogen too. So when men stop producing as much estrogen, they can develop osteoporosis as well. It's just not as common. No, because you're still making some estrogen. Now, if you have a complete hysterectomy where they take out your ovaries that make the estrogen, then yeah, you could eat calcium all day long and your body doesn't know to do anything with it. Then you're going to have to take prescription pills that take the place of the estrogen and telling your osteoblast to start working and putting it in there. Okay? All right. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take this thing off my ear.